This channel has covered the dealing and handling of this year's DCEU movies. We have criticised James Gunn, Peter Safran and David Zaslav for the handling of the mixed messaging for the future of DC in terms of DC Universe, the handling of the DCEU movies. We've been there, we've criticised them, there's been kind of half-baked, confusing information about the future. The promotion of these DCEU movies, the half-truths, I've criticised them. But everything that's transpired doesn't mean that James Gunn can't create a successful DC Universe IP and franchise. Now, he's never created his own franchise before. He's never been a CEO of a studio before. So a lot of this is very, very new. But he has made really good comic book content in terms of Peacemaker on streaming on Max, his Free Guardians movies, and of course his Suicide Squad movie was very well made. Didn't make much money, if any, but it was very well made. So we don't know if he can make a success of this. Some people want him to be successful, and other people are praying before they go to bed every night that he's not successful, and that's just the way that it is. That's the kind of divided DC fandom we find ourselves within right now. But there's been a lot of rumours about a world's finest movie. Basically, the world's finest is Batman and Superman together trying to stop crime. Uniting as a team. So this is this is part of the positive relationship of Batman and Superman, because James Gunn has discussed this very thing about the potential of a great friendship between Superman and Batman. Now, we already know that Zack Snyder went down a very different direction in terms of building the relationship between Batman and Superman. When they first meet and know of each other's existence, they hate each other. Batman attempts to kill Superman. By the end of Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, we see the beginning, the fledgling beginnings of a friendship between the two characters. But we really had to go down a really dark path to even see the fledgling beauty of that relationship. And again, in Zack Snyder's Justice League, the beginnings of that friendship, of course. And that's one way of going at it. James Gunn isn't going to go down that dark path. He's going to show from the very beginning that these two are friends. Of course, we're going to see the different ways that they go about solving crime and catching criminals and stopping criminals. These are two very different characters, and, you can't kind of paper over that. But it doesn't mean they can't be friends. So it's clear we're getting Superman Legacy first, then The Brave and the Bold next, and then potentially we could be getting a world's finest movie, which I think is a very, very good idea. The potential of a world's finest movie is a Batman and a Superman team up, but you can also team up their supporting characters in terms of Lois and Jimmy and Perry and even Supergirl, because we're going to get a Supergirl film and we're going to get a Supergirl in this DCU franchise as well, which is a really good idea. One of my frustrations was that Zack Snyder teased the Supergirl, but he never had the potential, he never had the time to be able to introduce a Supergirl into his universe. There didn't seem to be anywhere where he was planning to do that. There was hints about the empty pod in Man of Steel and the prequel comic that came as part of the marketing of Man of Steel, but there didn't seem to be anywhere where Zack said, well, we're bringing her in here. So that's interesting. So I'm really happy we're getting a Supergirl in the DCU. She's important. I'm happy we're getting her. Some people just think she's Superman in the costume. I don't believe that. I think she's important. We need her. She's a great character, and a lot of her graphic novels are really, really good. Anyway, so I think that's what can happen in a world's finest movie as well. But to have Batman and Superman team up in a positive way, as friends solving crime, is very, very exciting. And this will be a positive way of looking at this relationship. It's clear a lot of the fans and a lot of the public didn't react that well to Batman and Superman starting off as enemies. But Zack is a deconstructive storyteller. And there lies the problem. Because Todd Phillips is, into this realism like Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan is. But Todd Phillips made it very clear from the very beginning that he was working within the confines of an alternate universe, of where he wanted to do a DC Black Label franchise. So the public understood that he wasn't trying to make a mamby-pamby central universe for the general audience. He was just trying to tell an alternate universe story and trying to give us an origin story for the Joker. Now, a lot of people have never wanted, an origin story for the Joker, but because Todd was saying this isn't the main Joker, this is, if you like, a kind of fantasy, kind of, escapist kind of Joker in an alternate universe. That's why he got away with it. But in terms of Zack Snyder, he was working in the confines of a central universe for the general audience. And the general audience didn't react well to what he was doing because he's a deconstructive director. He's a deconstructive storyteller. So just like Todd Phillips, if he ever does work on DC again, which is unlikely, he needs to be working in an alternate universe, in something that's smaller. And you certainly can't be spending all that money if you're not bringing in the box office. Zack Snyder's movies are very expensive, as much as I love them. So James Gunn is doing the right thing here in working on a world's finest in terms of the positive relationship between Superman and Batman. I think a lot more of the audience will react very well to that. It's all about how people respond to Superman Legacy and what type of movie that's going to be. Of course, we may see a Batman cameo, a DC Universe Batman cameo in Superman Legacy, which will be very exciting because we already know that James is going to world build in Superman Legacy, although it's going to be a Superman movie about Superman and his world and Lois and Jimmy and Perry, and maybe even Supergirl may have a little cameo in there. Who knows? Who knows what they're planning? So this is a kind of, this is a cinematic universe that James Gunn is building. Only last week we found out that he has ambitious plans to develop one of the WB lots in the UK, which is very, very exciting. So he clearly has big plans. Now, whether these plans work out or not, I don't know. But DC fans have been let down for too long. For too long, we thought we could be getting something. And we could be getting a big franchise like the Marvel fans did. And we didn't. Because we were promised an awesome Green Lantern movie. We didn't get it. We thought that Superman Returns could be the thing to put Superman back on the map. As much as I liked the film, it wasn't what we hoped it would be, and it wasn't successful in the slightest. Then we got the DCEU, we got Man of Steel. Again, we hoped Man of Steel could be a Superman movie for everybody, but it wasn't. It shaved against the grain. And Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, again, I love both those movies with Batman and Superman in them, Man of Steel and BVS, but they weren't for everybody. DC movies either need to be honest that what they're doing, like Todd Phillips is, where he's saying, my movie isn't for everyone. Like Matt Reeves did with the Batman. My movie isn't for everyone, it's for hardcore Batman fans. And that's why the movie made $750 million. A big success for that movie, no matter what a certain fandom say. And so, when you're working in a central universe and the studio want you to attract the general audience, you need to make something slightly lighter. You can still have a dark tone to it. You can still have depth and tell stories. But at the end of the day, you need to make these characters likable, accessible. And the truth is, Henry Cavill's Superman and Ben Affleck's Batman weren't accessible to the general audience. The DCEU in general wasn't accessible to the general audience. So if you want Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan and David Goyer To make superhero fair about these characters, they have to be from an alternate universe, and it has to be made clear that it's not for everybody. But it was pretty clear from the studio that they wanted these people to make something for the general audience, and they didn't. And they failed within that mission because they don't care about the general audience. They just wanted to make great art, and the studio wanted to make money. Neither side is wrong, but if there was more communication and they brought in people, WB, who could deliver this, then they would be in a better position. Now, if when they released Batman Begins and Superman Returns, and then the Green Lantern movie, they would, and if they created a DC franchise then, a comparative one, they would have got there before the MCU. But they didn't do that. And they didn't they didn't make the right movies to do that. And they didn't bring in the right creatives to do that. And because there's been this big discussion, hasn't there, since the DCEU, since Man of Steel and BVS and the Snyder Cut, what's the right way to go with? Is it the way Kevin Feige went at it, a central universe that's bright in colour palettes? There's still depth in those early MCU movies, especially Iron Man and Captain America. Do you go at it that way so you can attract people? Or do you go down the dark and dingy route, and the deconstructive route that Zack Snyder went down? It's an interesting quandary. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer, but you can see which one made money and which one didn't make enough money for the studio, and it polarized the audience. It divided people. I remember social media when Man of Steel came out, and especially when BVS came out. So there's no denying that people want their Superman clean. It's as simple as that. And want their Superman a certain way. I think if you want a more kind of rougher Superman, maybe you should be watching The Boys, and maybe you should be standing Homelander. Maybe. Now, I don't really like the comparisons between Homelander and Henry Cavill's Superman. I don't believe they're the same character at all. But there are issues with the way Zack Snyder, Terrio, and even Goya wrote Superman. And I spoke about this the other day, and I don't want to go through it again. But anyway, James Gunn is in charge now, and his ideals of making CBMs and, comic book, TV shows and streaming shows and even games will be very different to what Zack Snyder did. That's obvious because they're different people with a different process. James Gunn isn't a deconstructive storyteller. And so it'd be interesting if James Gunn can pull off a more positive relationship between Superman and Batman. But I wouldn't misunderstand James Gunn because I've been very interested in what he's had to say. I know we've discussed the issues before and what he's done wrong, but he said a lot of interesting things. He's criticised certain things the Marvel Cinematic Universe did. He said they won't be doing those things in the DCU. He's spoken about the DCU being a more fantastical franchise than the MCU, which is a very interesting thing to say. What could that mean? Well, I think we will be going through the realms of Zatanna and Constantine and the magical universe of DC as well, which will be very, very interesting. So with James Gunn about, excuse me, but with James Gunn about, I think there's a bigger potential and, a bigger range. And I think there's more of an audience that could be attracted to what James Gunn's about to do. Because clearly David Zaslav wants to make a lot of money on the DC IP. The question for me has always been, can this IP become, a cinematic universe? Can that be successful? Or is the way to go to do what Matt Reeves is doing or what Todd Phillips is doing? Or can you do both? Can you have a successful DC Elseworlds universe with different directors doing different things? A perfect place for Zack Snyder to do his work. That's where Zack Snyder should have been from the beginning. A DC Elseworlds universe. I even think his movies would have made more money if people understood that they weren't really he wasn't really doing an MCU. But that was the misunderstanding. The studio wanted an MCU, right? And there's nothing wrong with that because A studio is a competitive company, and they're going to want to compete with their competitors. They're going to want to make as much money as they are. It makes sense. People like treat WB wanting to make money on DC as a dirty thing. It's not. I explained the other day, if you don't make money on the big movies you spend big on, then how can you have the arty little movies that we all want as well in the industry? So there's a misunderstanding there. You know, the studio wasn't wrong for wanting to make money on DC. They just brought in the wrong people to do it. And then the way they treated Zack and a lot of other people was wrong. And the way they went about trying to recycle the Snyderverse was wrong. They were lazy and they paid the price for their laziness. They made bad decisions from the beginning. You don't bring in Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan and Terrio and Goya if you want movies for the general audience. Facts, whether you like those facts or not, they are facts. So now they brought in someone like James Gunn. What are the qualities of James Gunn? We've spoken about the things he's done wrong, but he does have a quality. I've spoken before that he's not one of the best writer-directors of all time, but he's a very good, a really good, competent writer-director. And he can do a good job with the DCU. He could even, potentially against the odds, make a really, really good Superman legacy movie. And it'll be interesting what kind of character David Corenswet's Superman and Clark Kent is. I mean, look, Superman the movie succeeded against the odds. In fact, the character of Superman was in the same position as he is today. Discussions about him not being relatable. You know, you had hippie freaks who were demonstrating against the Vietnam War and Watergate who saw Superman as an agent of the status quo, the government's and Washington's bitch. He was used for propaganda material in the 70s as well, even during the Second World War. So Superman wasn't very popular when Superman the movie was released. And Superman the movie and Star Wars 77 were released just after Watergate and Vietnam. America had lost its innocence, but they brought innocence back to cinema. I think it's a perfect time to bring innocence back to cinema. But is that what James Gunn's planning on doing? James Gunn isn't Dick Donner. James Gunn can only do what James Gunn does. And I think that's important to understand. But I think James Gunn also understands what he did with Guardians and the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker, he can't really do with Superman. Superman has to be clean this time. He cannot be killing people. Superman must be Superman. That's important. Keep him clean. This is something Dick Donner said back in the 70s as well. We're not going to mess around with Granny's apple pie. And it's very interesting when you think about the negotiations, the Salkinds, who were the people producing Superman the movie. WB didn't produce Superman the movie, they only distributed it. The Salkinds paid for Superman the movie. And they had to have these negotiations. Because WB weren't involved as much, WB still owned DC, but they weren't making the movie. They weren't funding the movie, they were just distributing it. So because of that, the Salkinds had to have negotiations with DC, and they were negotiating with a man called Bernard Cashton, I think his name was. And DC had this thing about integrity of character. Now imagine that if DC were negotiating with Snyder and Goya and Nolan about integrity of character, and Goya goes, we're going to have Superman snapping Zod's neck. DC back then in the 70s, Bernard Cashton would have said, no, you're not making a Superman movie, guys. You ain't going to have Superman snapping somebody's neck, because this is what Bernard Cashton was talking about with the Salkinds of, when talking about Superman's integrity of character. So I think because WB are producing and funding Superman Legacy in the DCU, they don't have to have, negotiations with a company they already own in DC. But I think that Zaslav, at the very least, and Gunn and Safran understand that you have to keep Superman clean. In terms of Batman and the world's finest, what kind of Batman are we going to get? There's new rumours of an older Batman. Could it actually really be that George Clooney is the Batman of the DCU? I still doubt it. And we need a deeper explanation where the DC universe is, because I don't think it is where we left Barry Allen at the end of the Flash movie. Will we get further explanations in a post-credit screen of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom? I mean, James Wan's been saying it's his movie, and his movie has nothing to do with the other movies, but could they stick something in the post-credit scene? I think they could do, and James Wan couldn't do anything about it if they wanted to do that, but he's certainly not going to let them interfere with his movie. That's a different case in point. So we'll see. Certainly one way or the other, after Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is released, it will come as to some relief to me, because we can now then focus on the DC universe, because the DCEU is finished. We know that. I mean, I don't know what happens if Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, as unlikely as it is, becomes a $1 billion tentpole hit. Because then if James Wan wants a third movie, he gets a third movie, because David Zaslav isn't going to drop, a movie series that's been successful, but I think they would have to dump him in DC elsewhere, so then he can do whatever he wants. I think that's the only way, but I believe that James Gunn wants a white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aquaman. And I think that James Gunn doesn't want Momoa to continue as Aquaman. Now, Gunn hasn't really discussed the future of Aquaman, and if you've noticed, he's not promoting Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Very, very interesting. He's not getting involved with that film. Is it because Zaslav believes that Gunn has made things worse rather than making them better and helping the other DCEU movies make money? Probably. I don't think Gunn is the reason the other movies didn't make any money. They were never going to make any money. Now, maybe if we didn't know there was a new franchise, a new leadership, and they just kept their mouths shut, it would have been difficult because of rumours and leaks. Could those other movies made slightly more money? I would have expected Blue Beetle to at least make maybe 400 million, 500 million, maybe a solid 600 million at the very least. Maybe Shazam! Fury of the Gods is a perfectly fine, solid movie. So maybe that film could have made around the same as the first Shazam, because there isn't really a fan base for Shazam. And that's a shame, but there's not. If Black Adam was released in China as well, which is not the film's fault, that could have made a bit more money as well. So, and obviously the big announcement that Cavill was coming back as Superman, then taking that away from fans, also hurt those DCEU movies. But James Gunn wants a new Superman, and he's entitled to that. But the handling of bringing Cavill back, then not having him come back, was very, very problematic. But once Black Adam flopped, Zaslav wanted to go to another direction in terms of DC leadership. So it was Adby and DeLuca. Then he decided, well, you didn't make Black Adam a lot of money, so you're not going to be running DC. It's going to be James Gunn, who was still writing. He was still green-lit to do Superman Legacy, but Zaslav decided that he liked the script so much that James should be running the whole caboodle. Very, very interesting. So as I said on the top of the show, there's been lots of problems, but that doesn't mean James Gunn can't create a great DC Studios with great content. And I hate that word as much as every other actor and writer and director does. But in terms of DC, it is really content rather than art. But we will see. Maybe it will still be art. So James Gunn has this, big idea along with Zaslav. Games, movies, streaming, all of that, animation. And of course, we're going to see his first attempt at, an animated series, in terms of Creature Commandos next year. Which I've said before, I'm quite sure will be really, really good, because it's about a group of people, and I think that's what James Gunn's really good at. But it's all building up to Superman Legacy. So Gunn has got this kind of tentative plan, and we'll see if it can work. But it's no good criticising Gunn's plan that we haven't seen yet, when we've seen the other plans haven't worked. I love Zack Snyder's 3 DCEU movies, but they didn't attract as much as the audience that they needed to. Zack's movies are so expensive. Zack's movies all needed to make at least $1 billion because of the amount they cost, because Zack's movies are so beautiful. But because they're so beautiful and they take so much to make, they cost a lot of money, and they're like the problem. So his plan ultimately was destabilized, and it didn't work in terms of the box office. And that's a shame. But also, we want a DC universe that can attract as many people and please as many people as possible. We've spoken about, Superman being kept clean. But we haven't spoken about Batman. Batman's an interesting character because there's a perception. People who don't read the Batman comics actually think Batman is some Dexter Morgan serial killer, dark character. But for many years in the comics, that's not what he was or who he was. He was a quite clean character who also didn't kill. Then The Dark Knight Returns happened, which is a deconstructive comic. And I've said before, Zack Snyder was better off having a faithful adaptation to The Dark Knight Returns rather than what he and Terrio did with BVS, and I think that would have been a better idea, and I think the audience would have been more receptive to that. But the truth is, Zack Snyder isn't a man to bring in a general audience. He loves deconstruction. He's never going to keep Superman clean, and he did speak about Justice League 3 and Superman leading, a meta-human army, which would have been awesome. But that probably would have been right at the end of the movie. So Superman really had to be kicked and prodded and poked and prodded just to get there. Now, some people will say, well, he has to earn the right. And I understand what Zack's attempting to do. But ultimately, it didn't bring enough people to the table. It divided audiences. It was polarizing. It didn't work. One thing that Zaslav will want from James Gunn is not to polarize the audience. The day I'm looking forward to is seeing David Corenswet, which I assume will be next year now, in the brand new Superman costume, because we know that costume's already been designed. We already know that because they've been doing pre-production for a very long time, where we know they've been designing costumes for months. So James Gunn and probably David Corenswet will know what kind of costume David will be wearing. And the question everybody will be asking, is it pants or no pants? Will he be wearing the red trunks or not? Now, this has never been a big deal for me. He doesn't have to wear them. He can wear them. I believe we are going to a traditional Superman. I believe David Corenswet's Superman costume will have the red trunks. And I'm fine with that. In fact, I find that very, very exciting. And that will excite a lot of the fans. Again, there will be a certain fan base who will be, why is he wearing the trunks? You see, I do try and educate Snyder fans. Although I appreciate what Zack Snyder did, even being an all-round DC fan and not being a here for Zack person, when I hear some of them speak, more the stans than the fans, and there is a difference, by the way, they talk about, big Superman comic book readers or big fans of Superman who have been fans all these years as kind of bad people, just because they want a bright coloured suit and they want Superman to stay clean. But if you like, the Zack Snyder stands and even the fans of Zack Snyder have gatecrashed the Superman party and changed what Superman was. And that's a problem. And if that made money, if that retelling of the Superman myth made money, then Zack Snyder would still be telling his story. But he didn't make enough money. It's as simple as that. So now James Gunn will try and make a more faithful adaptation of the Superman myth and the Batman myth. Because whatever director is making Brave and the Bold, and right now it's Andy Muschietti, and let's see if he remains. I have my doubts. But anyway, we will see. Is James Gunn conducting the orchestra on all these films? It's why he's so hands-on in the development over in the UK of developing where they're going to be shooting all these DC movies, games, all these games they're going to be making, everything. It's very, very exciting, and James Gunn's all over this. It's him who's planning all of this. Now, can he do it? Can he go from being a really good, really good writer-director to actually orchestrating a successful DC cinematic gaming animated universe? Well, his plans thus far sound very, very, very ambitious, and if they work out, could be very exciting for every DC fan. That doesn't mean he hasn't made mistakes already in the handling of the DCEU movies, of the misinformation, the half-truths, and all of that. I get it. He's made mistakes, but he's been taking orders from his boss, David Zaslav. We also have to remember that. What's very important here in the planning of DC Universe is that James Gunn is not micromanaged by David Zaslav, as he has with the messaging and promotion of these DCEU movies. Zaslav must allow Gunn to do his thing. I think if James Gunn is allowed to do his thing, I think we could have a very exciting future with DC on film, animation, gaming, and everything else. But if Zaslav continues to micromanage what Gunn's doing, I think it's just going to end the same way as the DCEU did. See you again soon.